It has been suggested that Lucy Letby suffers from a particular mental health condition called Munchausen's by proxy. For those who don't know, Munchausen's by proxy is a mental health condition whereby a caregiver either fakes or induces illness in other people to receive attention. A factor that often gets missed in this discussion is that the very controversial doctor who was the main prosecution witness, Dr. Dr Evans, has a controversial background in diagnosing this condition. You can say, well, why does that matter? It may be the case that Dr. Evans, in an intellectually dishonest fashion, cuts certain corners in terms of the other evidence because of his erroneous belief in the prevalence of this condition. Alternative theories are that Letby did actually have Munchausen's, and that's why she would have committed such crimes, or that this Dr. Evans' primary interest was in getting paid to the extent that he would cynically use Munchausen's as a deflection and manipulation to help him achieve this goal of getting paid. A further factor to consider with Munchausen's by proxy is that, likely more than any other condition/motive, it has historically been the most prominent motive put forward in miscarriage of justice cases in comparison to its use in cases that have stood the test of time as safe convictions. The closest source to the investigation that I can see speculating that Letby had Munchausen's is the lead detective on the investigation, Paul Hughes, who said to The Independent that Munchausen's had been considered as an explanation. He would go on to say, obviously she's an attention seeker, but I don't know, it could be. I'll leave a link to this article in the description. So I haven't been able to find direct quotes of Dr. Evans speculating that Letby has Munchausen's. If you can find them, please let me know in the comments. However, there is evidence that Evans tends to operate in the shadows of investigations, so I don't think it's outlandish to think that the original source of Paul Hughes' Munchausen speculation came from Dr. Evans. The closest speculation I have seen from Dr. Evans is claims that Letby is an attention seeker.
I think there was a need to be the center of attention.
The accusations of attention seeking from Evans and Hughes seem to be at odds with other accounts. Looking at this headline in the Daily Mirror, What Killer Nurse Was Really Like, where Letby is first described as an odd loner. In a longer quotation, the mother of child I says, I remember thinking she was a bit quiet and a bit odd. She always seemed a bit of a loner. We saw her around on the odd occasion, but we didn't have much to do with her. You can see another interpretation of Letby's behaviour here. This account is closer to the Evans and Hughes interpretation. It comes from the mother of baby E's testimony to the Thirlwall inquiry, page 36 in A5, or I think page 9 in A4. Quote, I think her behaviour towards me was very different to other nurses, and that's something that I've reflected on. She was very attentive of me. Whenever she used to see me, she would hug me. She was just as upset as me, which, reflecting back on it now, is very odd behaviour, when none of the other nurses were really. Something that's drawing a lot of attention now, if you have been following the case, are reports that positive character references were reportedly warned of the case. It was first reported by the Telegraph and has now been discussed in Private Eye. Remember, feel free to pause if you want to read any of these excerpts in further detail. The fact that Letby is able to produce positive character references, albeit in the media and not in a court, is evidence against the idea that she has Munchausen's. For instance, Dominic Wilmot, who is a criminology lecturer who has speculated that Letby has Munchausen's, which seems to be based off a casual observation of the case, has said historically there was a complex interaction between this condition, as in Munchausen's, and a history of personality disorder diagnosis and characteristics, and were often found to be highly sadistic and narcissistic as described by those who knew them. In contrast, this is one of Letby's friends since childhood, speaking out on the BBC Panorama show.
I know Lucy, I've grown up with Lucy.
Have all of Lucy's friends stood by her?
Yes. We know she couldn't have done anything that she's accused of.
Professionally, as was mentioned recently in Private Eye, a Letby colleague revealed that she submitted in a questionnaire response to the Thirlwall inquiry, quote, "I had no concerns or suspicions about Lucy's conduct. She was an exemplary nurse who is completely innocent of all alleged crimes." So now to switch the focus to the prosecution witness Dr Evans and some of the background with this condition, Munchausen's by proxy. Some of the earliest documented series of cases of caregivers inducing illness for control or attention can be traced back to the 1950s. Although perhaps it occurred in earlier civilizations, it would be foolish to suggest that child abuse does not exist. Although the behavior patterns had been described by psychiatrists, and the term Munchausen's had been used to describe someone seeking attention for themselves, in 1977, British paediatrician Roy Meadow wrote a controversial but influential paper published in the Lancet Medical Journal called Munchausen's by Proxy. Whilst this condition would remain controversial, Roy Meadow would arguably get a vindication in 1993 with the high-profile conviction of Beverly Allett. By the late 90s and early 2000s, tremendous deference was being applied to doctors accusing mothers of having this condition, Munchausen's by proxy, in both the family court and in the criminal courts. A number of doctors, you could say a cult, would position themselves as experts in this condition, despite not necessarily having a psychiatry background. The doctors I'm going to focus on in this video are Dr. David Southall, Roy Meadow as mentioned, Dr. Martin Wald-Platt, and of course Dr. Dr Evans. One of the highest profile convictions of this era would occur in November 1999. Sally Clark was a solicitor who suffered 2 infant deaths separated by a couple of years. The second death provoked suspicion and an investigation, which would ultimately result in her conviction. Roy Meadow, testifying on statistical matters arguably outside his field of expertise, would claim the chances of 2 cot deaths occurring in one family without the use of foul play were around 1 in 73 million. Roy Meadow's work on Munchausen's by proxy would also play a role, with his 1977 paper published in the Lancet, referenced on 5 occasions during the trial. Within a couple of years, the conviction would start to be seen as a controversial one. The Royal Statistical Society would write to the Lord Chancellor in January 2002 complaining about the misuse of statistics in courts and saying that Meadows' 1 in 73 million figure was false. Dr. David Southall would join the pro-conviction lobby in a fashion of sorts. After watching a Channel 4 TV documentary questioning Sally Clark's guilt, he would accuse Steve Clark, Sally Clark's husband, of smothering the 2 infants after seeing him describe an occasion where one of the infants developed breathing difficulties. However, a hospital whistleblower would leak records to Steve Clark that showed evidence that one of the babies, Harry, was infected at various sites with the bacteria Staphylococcus aureus, including in his cerebrospinal fluid. In November 2001, Steve Clark, working with a wider legal team, would file an application to the Criminal Case Review Commission, complaining that pathologist Alan Williams had failed in his obligation to disclose to the defence evidence of the bacterial infection. The Criminal Case Review Commission would refer the Clark case back to the Court of Appeal in March 2002. In submissions to the Court of Appeal, defence experts would argue that it was likely Harry had died from natural causes due to this bacterial infection, which prosecution experts could not rule out. The second conviction was also quashed without the need for a retrial. At the original trial, neither defence nor prosecution were confident as to why Matthew had died. However, at the original trial, confident arguments were put forward as to the reasons for the death of Harry. Therefore, on the basis of bad character evidence, using Meadows' arguments about Munchausen's, and the statistical arguments that 2 cot deaths in an affluent family were unlikely to occur without foul play, a guilty verdict was rendered. However, with the new evidence that Harry had likely died of natural causes, the bad character evidence no longer held up. The statistical evidence was heavily criticised, and there was no real medical evidence to begin with. Following the release of Sally Clark in January 2003, Professor Meadows' reputation would take a further hit in May to June of 2003 with the trial of Trupti Patel. Patel was a pharmacist who had 3 children who had died in infancy. Going into the trial, Professor Meadow had brought Meadows' law to notoriety, which states, in an affluent family, 1 infant death is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 is murder, unless proven otherwise. During Patel's trial, geneticists would argue that if a family are passing on a gene that predisposes them to an increased likelihood of death in infancy, then it's not quite such a statistical marvel to have multiple infant deaths in the same family. Furthermore, some expert witnesses for the prosecution seemed to get cold feet on their murder theories and conceded to a lot of points on cross-examination. The ultimate result of the trial would be an acquittal. A further blow would occur to Professor Meadows' reputation in December 2003 with the release of Angela Cannings. Cannings had been convicted in 2002 for the murder of 2 of her babies on the basis of expert witness testimony provided by Dr. Martin Ward-Platt and Sir Roy Meadow. Dr. Ward-Platt and Professor Meadow had decided that Cannings must have had Munchausen's based off reading the medical notes of the infants and deciding that Cannings' behaviour at the time of the deaths was unusual. I'll leave a link in the description in case you want to examine the Cannings Court of Appeal decision for yourself. This paragraph from chapter 59 describes some of the prosecution case. The Crown's contention, in this case argued by Meadows and Ward-Platt, was that the appellant, aka Cannings, smothered Jason, and that the smothering began once the appellant knew that Mrs. Peacock was arriving at her home in an attempt to evoke sympathy. During Cannings' appeal, a psychiatry specialist would argue that her broader psychological history was inconsistent with an individual who had Munchausen's by proxy, and her background generally suggested she was an individual of good character. Professor Meadow was further criticised for giving expert witness testimony on neonatal gastroenterology, which was deemed outside his field of expertise and incompetent by the Court of Appeal. The main reason for the success of the Cannings appeal was the issue of genetics and a wider examination of her family tree, which revealed that sudden collapse or death in infancy for poorly understood reasons was common in her family background. Canning's half-sister, uncle, grandmother, and great-grandmother had all had at least one child who experienced serious issues during infancy. The next controversial doctor whose story will intertwine with Evans is Dr. David Southall. Dr. Southall was a doctor who had done some genuinely distinguished research early in his career. However, after his early work, he would later become obsessed with Munchausen's by proxy and the idea that mothers were intentionally harming their children for attention. The shift in the focus of Southall's career would start with an early vindication. He would controversially set up video and CCTV footage at the Royal Brompton Hospital where he was working to try and catch a mother who was suspected of abusing her children.
Nothing happened for a week. And it was getting very, very tense indeed in the hospital.
Whilst this case was controversial in the hospital, as I say, Southall would get a vindication on this occasion. The video is conclusive, but is probably too sensitive for YouTube.
I come in, it's 100% obvious. Mother had suffocated the child with a T-shirt. No question about it. It's black and white.
Building on this early vindication, Southall would soon set up a funnel where parents who were suspected of child abuse would send their children for evaluation at a facility in North Staffordshire. It is around this time where Southall and Evans' stories would intertwine. Looking at this old newspaper article, following the part highlighted, underlined in red, if you can make it out, quote, Swansea Singleton Hospital, presumably on Evans' orders, sent a child suspected of suffering abuse to the unit. A hidden camera recorded its parent trying to smother the child. Dr. Evans visited the specialist spy camera paediatric clinic in Stoke-on-Trent and spent a day in the children's ward, which has pioneered the use of covert CCTV to trap parents suspected of harming their children. I will have more to say about this newspaper article later. In terms of Southall's covert surveillance, he would accumulate 5 or 6 black and white cases, which he would regularly show to the media. However, in many other cases, when it came to prosecuting the cases, he would run into opposition in court.
Professor Colin Morley, who's quite a well-known expert in this field, has come forward to say that he's seen something like 6 or 7 of the videotapes himself as an expert in proceedings, and he disagrees with Southall's interpretation.
Aside from Professor Morley, some of Dr. Southall's other most notorious opponents during this era would be Dr. Paul Johnson and psychiatrist Lisa Blakemore-Brown. Dr. Southall's research into children with breathing issues would cross paths with his work on Munchausen by proxy, as children who were taken off their parents and placed into foster care would often end up in his research projects. Dee McLean is one mother who would have a child who would suffer such a fate. However, initially she actually sought Dr. Southall out. She had a son called Ben who was having breathing difficulties that were difficult to diagnose.
I saw Dr. Southall on television one morning, one of the early morning chat shows, and he was talking about a monitor that he designed.
By modern standards, Dr. Southall's breath analysis machine would be considered woefully suboptimal in terms of detecting the relevant factors, such as heart rate, blood oxygen level, breathing patterns, etc. When Southall's equipment failed to diagnose the problem, he turned on the mother, accusing her of harming her own child.
I just never in my wildest dreams ever thought that myself or Dave could be accused of anything like this.
David Southall would get social services involved. Case conferences would be called and the case would soon be referred to the family court. Southall would testify under oath as to his theories as to the underlying source of Ben's breathing problems.
You know, I was accused of poisoning, smothering, all sorts of things that just couldn't have been further from the truth.
Ben would enter foster care, and he would enter at least one of Dr. Southall's research projects. Mrs. McLean would appeal the family court decision. After a year, she would be successful and Ben would be returned to her from foster care. However, he would apparently never be the same. You can see Ben playing here as a child. You can later see him as an adult here, and I think you can make out he doesn't look quite right. The story from the McLeans is that Ben suffered brain damage during one of Dr. Southall's research projects. The McLeans would initially have a hard time being believed, but as Dr. Southall's reputation declined over the years, the McLeans gained credibility, and eventually the police would start an investigation known as the Age case.
I'm going to see my solicitor.
About what?
About my discussions with the police tomorrow about the H case.
Even though the police were investigating over a decade later, they still managed to build a case and got as far as turning over their case to the Crown Prosecution Service.
I'm a suspect.
What's the charge?
Grievous bodily harm.
The Crown Prosecution Service would decide not to bring charges, presumably because it was hard to pinpoint the exact moment Ben developed brain damage, considering that he had known breathing issues. Dr. Southall would also be struck off the medical register twice, although reinstated on appeals. His background is hugely controversial and there are many articles written on it, but next to focus on Dr. Evans and how he crosses paths with some of these other controversial doctors. The first thing that I think is worth considering with Dr. Evans is there any evidence from the Letby investigation that he might be untrustworthy and or try to push things through the back door? This is important because I think you might start to see certain patterns which crop up in cases in which Evans is involved. Looking at BBC reporter Dan O'Donoghue's play-by-play tweets from the 7th of March 2023, Mr. Myers, as in Letby's lawyer, has just been questioning Dr. Evans about how he was approached to review these cases. Evans responds by lying and lying under oath, saying he was approached. Ben Myers, Letby's defence lawyer, then pulls up an email which has been uncovered, which shows he approached the National Crime Agency, saying the Letby case, quote, sounds like my kind of case. The motive defence lawyer Ben Myers suggests is that Evans was touting for business. It sounds at first glance like an outlandish motive, that Evans would insert himself into an investigation of great sensitivity and then act in bad faith just so that he could earn money. Records on Companies House do show that Evans earned large amounts of money from his work on the Letby case. I think when you look a bit further into Evans' background, I think it's worth keeping an open mind as to what would constitute too much of a low blow for him. The next review that hints at bad character on the part of Dr. Evans that came out in the Letby case but technically refers to another case is this dressing down by Lord Justice Jackson. Picking out some quotes, finally and of greatest concern, Dr. Evans makes no effort to provide a balanced opinion. He's also accused of working out an explanation and also partisan expressions of opinion. Some don't know, but Evans has also had a political career and the same themes crop up there. In this article, Evans is referred to by a member of his party as a puppet who is, quote, controlled by elements outside the party. I'm not sure of the specifics, but there is an implication of some kind of collusion and skullduggery going on in the background. So now, referring back to this old newspaper article, which features Evans, the main headline to the story is that Evans suspected a mother of child abuse and then sent her to Dr. Southall's facility in North Staffordshire for observation. I'm inclined to give Evans the benefit of the doubt on this occasion. I'm not going to say he's all bad. However, looking a bit deeper into the article, you see another case described which looks a bit more contentious. Quote, in one case, he dealt with a woman in the Midlands. A woman had begun legal action against doctors for allegedly failing to properly treat her child's skin condition. In other words, a mother has brought a medical negligence claim. What you will start to see with Evans is a pattern where when individuals bring medical negligence claims, he turns the table on the accusers accusing them in turn of Munchausen's. Now that more experts are looking at the case notes and also the information that came out in the court reports, I think the Letby case could be considered a Munchausen's versus medical negligence case. But what I think is more concerning are cases where Evans' own clinical practice and diagnosis are in question when he plays the Munchausen's card.
I dealt with a number of child abuse cases from my own department.
I'm going to talk about a case called the Bonnie Linda Lewis case. My understanding of this case, which I will evidence to an extent, is in short that after incompetent treatment and a failure to make an accurate diagnosis, Dr. Evans would accuse the mother of Munchausen's by proxy and abuse. It would be established that the medical concerns were legitimate, but the psychological and emotional abuse allegations would hold up. Due to the sensitivity of this case, I'm going to offer no commentary on the relationship between the mother and the daughter. That being said, my understanding is that public interest law states that no injunction can ever be taken out to cover up criminal acts. The allegations against Dr. Evans in this case include medical negligence, perjury, and attempted murder. Furthermore, it was recently reported in the Daily Mail that Evans has claimed to have taken part in more than 250 cases in the family court alone. He has also been involved in several other murder investigations. If it ever emerges definitively that Evans has been giving testimony in bad faith, then a number of cases will need to be reviewed. Looking at the Bonnie Linda Lewis case, the name is an alias, by the way. There are several commentators who have described Dr. Evans' alleged malfeasance during the case. One of them is Brian Gurish, a writer for the magazine called UK Column.
And Dr. Evans, who we're very interested in, shame he's not here tonight, he says there's nothing wrong with Bonnie, but there is something wrong with her mother.
Another individual who has commented on the case is Penny Mellor, a member of a group called Mothers Against Munchausen's allegations.
I couldn't understand if doctors have been prescribing drugs, how it could then be blamed on the parent.
A third witness in this case is counsellor Kevin Edwards, who was a counsellor in South Wales at the time. To put it into a timeline so that you can make sense of the medical negligence claims, in November 1996, Bonnie, going by her alias, is admitted to Singleton Hospital. She has a fever and a throbbing pain around the base of her sternum through to her back. She is seen by Dr. Evans. Dr. Dowie Evans has a hard time making a diagnosis, but he suspects appendicitis. Bonnie is eventually discharged. When the symptoms persist, the family then turn to Neath Hospital nearby. You can't necessarily pin everything that takes place here on Dr. Evans, but apparently at this hospital they go as far as acting on the appendicitis suspicions and remove what will later be described as a perfectly healthy appendix. So once again, the question here, is there any evidence from the Letby case that makes it sound like this is something that Evans would do? The scenario is a condition that looks like it could make for a complicated route to a diagnosis. Evans appears to simplify the issue and pigeonhole it as a more common problem. Evans has described an attitude when looking at the Letby case that could suggest he tends to oversimplify things.
I mean, babies are simple things. There's not a lot that can go wrong with them.
He goes on to describe 4 neat little boxes he compartmentalizes baby issues into.
If they're premature, they have breathing difficulties, they're at risk of infection, they're at risk of hemorrhage, and of course, newborn babies may have congenital problems.
So to me, it sounds credible to think that Dr. Evans would try to make a fairly common diagnosis in a situation where the symptoms are a bit more unusual. Referring back to the Bonnie Linda Lewis timeline, in March 1997 they would go to Bridgend Hospital. By this time point, they would believe the appendectomy had done nothing for the symptoms. It is at this point that Dr. Olafy mentions Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. Ulcers in the gastrointestinal tract are discovered, and antacid medication is prescribed. Allegedly, Bonnie would be referred to Great Ormond Street Hospital. However, at the last minute, this would be blocked by Singleton Hospital, which is Dr. Evans' hospital. Back at Singleton Hospital, Bonnie is seen once again by Dr. Evans. At Singleton Hospital, Bonnie is treated by Dr. Evans, who allegedly prescribes 80 milligrams of oral morphine for pain. Brian Gurish has speculated that this may have been an attempt to silence the issue by Dr. Evans, as the dosage is excessive.
Because if Mum had gone home and given her daughter that oral morphine, she would have killed her. And then we know where the blame would have been. Woomph, Mum.
When Bonnie's symptoms flare up in April 1997, being disillusioned with local hospitals, the family travel all the way from South Wales to Alderhay Children's Hospital in Liverpool. Once again, they are discharged without a firm diagnosis. In late May and early June 1997, Bonnie is referred to the Royal Free Hospital in London for a specialist paediatric gastroenterology review of the case. There she has an endoscopy and is diagnosed with colon obstruction and ulcerative colitis. She is prescribed with mesalamine. So at this point, I would like to say, please let me know in the comments if you have medical training. The way I understand it is there are two credible diagnoses which have been proposed, which are ulcerative colitis at the Royal Free Hospital and Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, which was suggested at Bridgend Hospital. Then there is the out-of-left-field diagnosis of appendicitis, which started with Dr. Evans. When I say two credible diagnoses, ultimately only one of these diagnoses is going to be correct. However, there is at least a significant overlap in the symptoms of these conditions. The story goes that it is actually Zollinger's that the girl is suffering from. There are published studies which show that Zollinger-Ellison syndrome is a difficult diagnosis to make. It can get confused with other conditions such as Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. As I understand it, the issue here is that the antacids that have been prescribed treat the symptoms, but they don't treat the underlying cause. So once the medication has run out, the condition is inevitably going to flare up again. The mesalamine does not address the issue of excess gastric acid production. So when Bonnie's symptoms flare up again, and she takes time off school, it gives Evans a chance to manipulate events. A social service case conference will be called, the first of which would take place on 25th of July 1997. This letter, which you can pause to read, relates to the case conference. To me, the document looks legitimate. I think it has been obtained during the disclosure process as part of the legal proceedings. The passage next to the highlighted arrow is particularly disturbing, considering Dr. Evans' conflicts of interest in this case. Conference recommended that the supervision of any medical support intervention is undertaken entirely under the supervision of the family GP, Dr. Roberts, and consultant paediatrician, Dr. D. Evans. Any referrals to other specialists, e.g. psychiatrist, should occur only after positive consultation between Dr. Roberts and Dr. Evans. A letter from Dr. Evans dated a couple of days later reveals more about the case. Quoting Dr. Evans' letter, "The family took Bonnie in a van to Alderhay Children's Hospital in the middle of the night instead of arranging admission to a local hospital. This is both reckless and irresponsible. This shows strongly to me that this family were placing Bonnie's health as secondary interest to their own attempt to harness the medical limelight and indulge in what I can only describe as attention-seeking by proxy. I don't know about you, but to me the idea of driving from South Wales to Liverpool in the middle of the night, petrol costs aside, sounds more like a pain in the backside than an indulgence."
And here is this doctor not passing this correspondence through Mum, but actually pushing it through the back door.
Here is another letter. This one is addressed towards Dr. Evans, and it is dated 28th of July 1997, which is a couple of days after the case conference. There is some discussion about the medical situation and what may potentially be a degree of belligerence from Mrs. Lewis at the Royal Free. The final paragraph states, "I understand that Mrs. Lewis is not aware of the referral to this team, and I have not contacted her, and will not do so until we have had our meeting."
This doctor is manoeuvring in the background with social services.
There is another letter here from Dr. Evans, where he's writing to legal services, pushing things. Towards the end of the letter, it does confirm that the family were pursuing a medical negligence claim. Highlighted in red, quote, "I also understand that the family are employing solicitors because of their concern about the medical management. I would have no difficulty at all in discussing the situation with any representative of this family." Thanks to the diligent efforts of Dr. Evans, the case would be referred to the family court, where a number of sanctions would be placed against Mrs. Lewis. The family would then travel to America looking for a diagnosis for Bonnie's illness, which would also discredit the accusation of attention seeking by proxy, which has been levelled at Mrs. Lewis. The family had a legal right to take the daughter to the United States, though they were obligated to keep local doctors informed. Perhaps sweating that his web of lies was about to come crashing down, Dr. Evans would seemingly panic when he got wind of this. He would send his reports about Bonnie to the heavyweight of the scene at the time, Sir Roy Meadow. Remember, this was 5 years before Meadow would be disgraced in 2003, and at the time was known as Sir Roy Meadow, with an impactful reputation. Sir Roy Meadow would co-sign the reports without actually meeting Bonnie or the mother. Bonnie's welfare would now be seen as a matter of urgency. Social services would travel to the United States, and Bonnie would be brought back to the UK and placed into foster care. If you have confidence in Dr. Evans, you could say the reason he did this is because he was very worried about the girl's welfare. There is some documentation that shows social services did not have the appropriate legal authority to do this. There is also evidence that Dr. Evans may have perjured himself during this process, which may fall under US jurisdiction. Looking at this document, Judge Evans' words, reading through the bits underlined in red, "I was just leaving court on a Friday." I think he's phrasing it like that to suggest something very bizarre is about to happen. Continuing to quote Judge Evans, when the phone rang and it was clerk to Judge Dawson in Orlando, who was at the time involved in the case. And as a result, I spoke to the judge. I think he just wanted to make contact between the two jurisdictions. And what I told him was that it was my understanding that the order that I had made saying the child should not be removed from the jurisdiction was in fact made the day after the child had in fact left the jurisdiction. So I think what he's saying here is that he was going to make an order which registered Bonnie as a flight risk. However, before he had a chance to do that, he has been preempted by Evans and social services. You can see a bit more in this document about how Mrs. Lewis allegedly becomes a perpetrator of emotional abuse UK side, but a victim US side. Quote, "The other thing I told him was, because in a typical sort of direct American way, he said, 'Well, what do you want me to do about it?' And I said, 'Well, that is a matter for you in your jurisdiction.' I said, 'All I will tell you is that we have proceedings going on in this country, but what happens in your jurisdiction is a matter entirely for you.'" Furthermore, the judge continues, quote, "I wanted to make it abundantly clear that I said, as far as I was concerned, firstly, the child had already left when I made that order, so it didn't seem to me that there was any breach of the order. And the second thing is that the Americans must deal with the matter according to whatever evidence they have, and I gathered from the judge that they had some evidence because proceedings had already started." You can see a bit more about this with a letter from Neathport Talbot County Councillor Keith Davies. In a letter addressed to Mrs. Lewis, he says, "The officers of this council then brought your daughter back to this country as a flight was arranged on the 25th of February 1998 and placed in foster care. I have reviewed the events and the expenditure that we incurred as a local authority in sending 2 officers to the United States of America, and I have been wholly satisfied that the expenditure was unlawful and ultra vires. Personally, with my rudimentary legal knowledge, I had to look this term ultra vires up. As I understand it, it's Latin for beyond powers. So it's like the police coming to your house and searching it without a search warrant. Another document here shows that Miss Lewis was actually taking out legal action in the United States. Quote, I believe it was mentioned in the last set of proceedings that Miss Lewis had in fact commenced an action in the United States courts. Presumably, she would have had access to such orders when she commenced that action. You can see a bit more here about how Evans is alleged to have misrepresented things with this affidavit if the document is legitimate, which it looks to me that it is. On February the 12th, 1998, the Department of Children and Families received an abuse report alleging that Bonnie has been diagnosed with Munchausen syndrome by proxy in her native country of Wales. There is a court order issued in Great Britain for the pickup of the child to be placed in custody. The report stated that the parents fled Great Britain to the United States, presumably for a second opinion. It was reported that the child had been presenting as needing many procedures for abdominal pain and other gastrointestinal problems. So far, no procedures have been performed, as the need to the physicians has not been compelling. The obvious issue here is that although it was in the pipeline that flight would be blocked, the document suggests it hadn't been blocked at that stage. In a letter to Child Protection, Evans misrepresents the nature of this affidavit. I feel that we need to give ourselves a pat on the back for dealing with this very difficult problem, unique in my experience, in the way that we have. Taking court action with a view to separating a child from its mother is not something that one should do without careful consideration. The events of the past few weeks have shown that we were absolutely correct to do so. It is pleasing to read the opinion of the doctors in Florida. They were quite categorical in establishing a diagnosis of Munchausen syndrome by proxy without receiving any information from any centre in the UK. Yet the affidavit clearly states that they received an abuse report. Brian Garish has said that the hospital trips in America were beneficial in terms of establishing a diagnosis.
A diagnosis was achieved in the state because it is in the states that Zollinger's is again coming up.
So looking at Munchausen's from a bit more of an academic psychiatry point of view, looking at this study titled Monsters in the Closet, Munchausen Syndrome by Proxy, singling out this excerpt, expert estimates range from 1 in a million children to 2.8 in 100,000 children. So in general, I think it's something you would expect a normal paediatrician to find once or twice in their career, if at all, in normal clinical practice. Yet there is evidence Dr. Evans had a direct line to Dr. Southall, and there are dubious circumstances when he brings the condition up. The other Munchausen's advocate, who has described it as an underreported phenomenon, is Dr. Martin Ward-Platt. He hasn't featured much in this video outside of the fact that he was a prosecution witness in the Angela Cannings miscarriage of justice. Early on in the Letby case, he was recruited as a prosecution witness, which seems like a strange choice considering his background.
Dr. Martin Ward-Platt was a neonatologist in Newcastle upon Tyne, highly regarded, great guy.
Unfortunately, Dr. Martin Ward-Platt developed an illness before the trial. So in conclusion, in my opinion, the issue of Munchausen syndrome by proxy needs attention. Firstly, because it has been involved in a very high proportion of miscarriages of justice. Secondly, because you've seen that Dr. Evans sees this condition a lot more regularly than you would expect. He has had ties to several doctors who are big believers in this condition and have featured prominently in miscarriages of justice. Finally, I'm not sure necessarily how many of the stories about Dr. Evans are true, but I am suspicious of him, and I think many of the cases he has been involved with could do with a review, similar to the scenario that occurred with Roy Meadow 2 decades ago. However, I do think there is an appropriate situation for a Munchausen's diagnosis if it involves doctors and psychiatrists working together.